My name is Caitlin, and today we are talking about printmaking basics. I hope you guys can hear me. I'm sorry, this is a bit different from my normal setup. So if you can't hear me at any point, just let me know, okay? Today we will be covering the basics of printmaking. This class is geared towards adults as it will demonstrate methods using sharp tools. As such, it is not recommended for young children or those not comfortable using those tools. We will start with a very brief overview of the several types of printmaking, but we'll focus today primarily on the lino cut technique. If you do not have access to lino cut tools or are just interested in learning more about the printmaking process, currently the Plano Public Library offers access to an adult stamping steam kit. This provides basic tools for carving a rubber stamp. All that is needed is to place a hold on the kit and to be notified of its availability at your Plano Public Library location. So let's get started. Next slide, please, Meredith. Next one, please. So what is printmaking? At its most basic, it is an artistic process based on transferring images from a printing plate onto another surface, normally paper or fabric. So the traditional techniques, woodcut is a form of relief printing. Relief printing is a family of methods where a printing block, plate, or matrix has had ink applied to its surface, but not to any recessed methods. Today, we will be doing a relief printmaking technique. So woodcut is a relief printing technique in which an artist carves an image into the surface of a block of wood, typically with a gouge, leaving the printing parts level with the surface while removing the non-printing parts. This can use the same type of tool, carving tool, as a lino cut tool, but those blades are typically much, much sharper because the surface is so much harder. And secondly, etching is a process of using a strong acid or other mordant kind of chemical to cut into unprotected parts of a metal surface to create a design and intaglio in the metal. So intaglio is the process of cutting a design into a surface. So this is the direct opposite of relief printing. Now, engraving is the practice of incising or cutting a design onto a hard, usually flat surface by cutting grooves into it with a burn. Now this is similar in a way to etching, but it's not etching. Engraving is typically done through a technique called dry point, which is in fact part of the intaglio family. It is when an image is incised into a plate with a needle, and it's creating like a raised ridge along a furrow that is not scraped or filed away as it is in engraving. So when that's done, you can actually press it onto paper to get your relief print. Lithography is a method of printing originally based on the immiscibility, which is the property where two substances are not capable of combining to form a similar mixture. It is, in fact, when using a lithographic stone, which is typically limestone or a metal plate with a smooth surface. It takes a typically like a piece of artwork or text, and it prints it onto paper or another suitable material. What that can look like is a tube with the image printed around it, and then it's rolled flat out onto the stone, and then it's continued to be pressed from there. That's a very simplistic overview of lithography, but it's very cool, and it's a very cool technique. Screen printing is a method where mesh is used to transfer ink onto a surface in the subtracted format. So these typically use stencils and a blade or a squeegee that is moved across the screen to fill in the open mesh areas with the surface. So typically, screen printing is done one color at a time, but you can do several colors with this method to produce a multicolored image or design. It's a lot of fun. Okay, next slide. So these are some examples. So that first image there, you have a woodblock print by Yoshitoshi Sukokia. I probably butchered that last name, my apologies. But it's titled Smoky, and it is a woodblock print, and it's actually a great example of a multi-colored print. So it probably used more than just one wood block to get the colors and the different shadings for that piece. The second one in the middle by Alan Osterland, Dorotheum, is an example of an etching. And again, it's the same thing where they probably had more than one plate for that process to get the different colors. And it's also why if you look at the edges with the color, they're slightly blurred. So it's not an exact method. The lines are crisp and clean, but the colors have a slight blurred effect to them. The third one is an example of a lithographic stone, in this case, limestone, and it printed a mirror image of a map of Munich. So as you can see, this is just a great example of printing and design work. So whenever you're doing a design, you have to think about how it's going to print. So as in this case with that map, they had to make sure that they designed it backwards on the plate so that when it printed, it would be legible to be read. Because if they had designed it on the plate in the normal readable direction, when they printed it, it would have been backwards and it would have been a very confusing map. All right, so today we are focusing on the lino-cut printmaking method, and linoleum is a composite sheet material with a burlap backing. So if you see in my little video on the screen, you can see I have linoleum up and it has that burlap backing. And it can come in a variety of firmness. Linoleum today is able to be very soft, or it can be extremely hard. And then in terms of printing, you can create a monochrome print, which is just one color, or you can do multicolored prints. What is important to be known about multicolored prints, as you can see in the example to the right by Pablo Picasso, Les Vindageurs, which is grape harvesters in French. It actually was a series of 3 or 4 lino-cut blocks, I believe, to get those colors and the desired placements, because for each area that was printed, it had to be a raised area on the block. So when you do the inking, you only ink those areas that are raised. So it's very important that if you're going to do a multicolored print, that your blocks are all the same size and that your designs are very precise so that you get the printing that you desire at the end. Do we have any questions so far?
None yet.
Cool. All right, so before we jump in to our demo, the next slide, I believe, has some safety. Oh, no, sorry, tools first, then we get into the safety. So to carve linoleum, we have some tools that are very common in this process. So there's a list of different blades. In my example, in my tool that I have here, it all fits into the end. So you have your knife blade, which typically, let's see, is a small knife, and it's used for precise cutting, for corners, for when you want to outline lines. And it's very sharp, so always make sure you're grabbing from this rounded end that's blunt. And when you put it, if you have a blade like mine, you always put it blade first up into the I guess handheld area. Now we have a gouge tool. Typically in most kits you get 2 different sizes, and it's not to be confused with the V tool. But this is a large gouge tool. Let's see. And it allows you to take out areas of large linoleum when you need to cut away a lot of relief area. This is the tool you'd want to use. And then there's a smaller gouge tool as well to take out large quantities, but maybe in a more narrow area. So again, very useful for your projects. Important to know what types there are so you can use them properly in your design. And then the last type that we'll discuss is that B tool. This can really help with cutting.
Hey, Caitlin, can you repeat that again? Your microphone cut out. Pardon our microphone.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. So, did you hear me say about the V tool blade?
I think it cut out right as you were getting to that.
Okay, so here we have the 2 sizes for the V tool, and again, I would say that these allow you to be a little bit more precise than the gouge tool. It can be used for taking out larger areas again, but for instance, this smaller one is really great when you have lines that are close together and you need to be a little bit more precise with where you're cutting so that you don't cut away bits and pieces that you don't want. It's also really great if you're doing small details in your design.
Hey, Caitlin?
Yes.
Could we go over all of these when your screen is being shared as well so that we can see the
Yes.
tools better?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, and then we also have a brayer, which is that tool on your screen that is rounded. It's very similar to a paint roller. And it's what you actually use to ink your plate, your lino plate, your lino block. And what Meredith is circling on the screen is in fact the baren, and that's what you use to press your plate into the ink. In place of the baren, you don't have to have that specific tool. You can actually use a wooden spoon to help rub your plate into the ink to get even inking across it on your paper print that you're doing. You can also use pretty much any rounded surface to help get that even spreading of the ink. So I think that covers the tools. We'll go over the blades again when my screen is larger. So now we'll get into our safety features. So I would recommend if you're new to LinoCut that you use what is called a bench hook, and it's a device used to hold the printing block while still carving. So as you can see, there's a lip at the end that's raised. That kind of holds your lino block against it, and the lip that goes under goes against your table, helping you stabilize your block on the table so it doesn't move further than you have it pressed against that hook. And then I always recommend carving away from yourself and others. So if you're ever sitting at a table with other people, don't carve towards them. Don't carve yourself, because otherwise you will hurt your fingers. I can tell you from experience, I've done it before. It's not fun. Definitely not a recommended experience. And also, don't carve with a dull blade or damaged tools. So a dull blade is going to make you push harder into the material, and that in turn can mean that you accidentally slip and you can still gouge yourself and hurt yourself. So it's always good to sharpen your tools, make sure that they're taken care of. It's also, if they're dull in your carving, you are apt to damage them further. And a damaged tool can be a nicked blade, it can be anything like that. And if you carve with them, you have the possibility of damaging them further, of having them shatter. And again, your hands are very sensitive, and you don't want any splinters from a blade coming at your hands or flying up to your eyes. Okay, so I think we're going to switch over to the demo. Okay, so before we jump into that, I'm going to showcase these blades again. So, I believe the first one I mentioned was that knife blade. So as you can see, it's got that nice sharp edge here, a good point here. So it's really good for getting corners, for outlining fine lines in your design on the block. And it's also important, always grab by this nice blunt rounded edge at the base. Now the tool that's in my blade currently, if you have a tool like this, this bit right here, you rotate that to loosen it, and then this bit pulls right out. And when you're changing out your blades, always try and grab this wide bit right here. So as you can see, this right here is narrow. There's a nice little lip here for your finger to grab, and then we'll just slip it right back in. And this is again, that large gouge tool, and it's really good for clearing away large areas. Always make sure it's also firmly tightened in here, because you don't want it to fall out. As you can see, if it's not all the way in there as well, if you put any kind of pressure, it's going to fall out. And again, you don't want to do that and risk damaging your design or your hands. So righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Another bit is this piece here. If you have this model, it can come all the way off, and you risk losing that middle piece in there that holds your blade where you want it. So you don't need to loosen it quite that much, but you do want it loose enough to where you get this blade in there all the way to that middle bit, and then tighten it again. So that's too loose and it's not straight, which is gonna bother me. There we go. These other blades that we have here. So we have our V tool. Let's see. You can see that. So as you can see, the blade is in the shape of a V, and it can help you get some more precise lines, as well as clear away large areas. I usually carve at a slight angle with this, so I get that straight line when I cut. But it's also, if you carve with your blade just barely into the linoleum, you can get a sharper line with the base of that V, because the gouge tool is a large circle, so you're not going to get a line with that. Now, I wouldn't, unless the line was really big, I wouldn't use the big V tool for that. I would probably use this smaller one here, again, for any precise lines or details that I want in the design. And this is a smaller gouge tool right here. And this is a another smaller V. So I actually have 3 sizes, I believe, in one of my blades. Okay, so I'm gonna put these back because I also like the weight of the blades and the handle whenever I'm carving, because it doesn't feel quite so top heavy then. But before you actually get to your lino block, and again, linoleum has that burlap backing. Now there are other materials you can use that still get the same kind of effect as a linoleum piece. Offered in our steam kits. This is an example by the wonderful Anna Kapinska. This is a rubber stamp. So again, you can use the same tools right here to carve this softer material, but it is a rubber backing, so it doesn't have that burlap backing. I like the burlap backing because it will tell me kind of how deep I'm going. With this, what you have to be careful about is knowing how deep you're cutting so that you don't go all the way through it. Now, we do have in our kits the pink material, and this is another example of the wonderful Anna Kapinska. She is extremely talented, but you can see a couple different techniques from the blades just at the start already that she used to get her line straight, to cut away all this area to the side that she didn't want in the final print. And this rubber is a bit thicker than the gray. So you can see she had quite a bit carved down into. And those are all things to be aware of at the start when you have your material selected. So if you're new to lino cutting, you may want to start with a softer material than a linoleum block, just until you get comfortable with how deep you're cutting, because overcutting or not being comfortable with your tools can result in not getting the final cut design that you're wanting. So when you do your printing, this is an example, you get the desired finished result. So part of that is, in fact, transferring your design onto a block. And there's a couple of different methods with which you can do that. So if you're a DIY person at home, you don't have all the supplies I'm mentioning, transferring designs to a lino block is typically done in a couple different methods. You can either have graphite transferred paper, draw your design on the top and lay it on your linoleum block and just run a pencil across it, and have the pressure rub it off onto your linoleum piece. Or if you're like me and you don't have that, you can take wax paper and a permanent marker and trace a pre-drawn design onto the paper, ink it in black, and with enough pressure, I actually use the brayer to increase pressure. You may have to do it a couple times, but eventually that ink should rub off onto the plate, helping you get the design transferred. So that's one method. Or if you have a lighter colored piece of linoleum, a great way to just get going is take a pencil and draw right on the block. Now, I would not recommend doing that on a linoleum colored like this. This is a older piece of linoleum, and it's actually one that I won't use because it's too old. It's very, very firm. The only way I could use this for carving would be if I had an iron and I had it on a low setting, because heat will actually make linoleum softer for carving. So if you're using linoleum and it's very firm and it's hard to cut without putting a lot of pressure on it, get out your iron, take a towel, a cloth towel, lay it on top of your piece of linoleum, and just run it over it for maybe a minute or two. You don't want to have your iron on at a high heat because when you're done, your piece of linoleum will then be too hot to cut. But if you're ever running into an issue where it's just you're really having to dig in, that would be the method that I would recommend for cutting. But again, for design transfer, I would not draw on pencil on this because it's very hard to be seen. Just to show you, holding that up, you can't even see you can barely see the line that I drew on that. If you do have a darker piece of linoleum, I would take marker. You can at least see that. So you could probably get away with sketching a design on your block and pencil and going over it in marker. But again, it just depends on how much effort you're wanting to put into it. There's a fourth method for design transfer that gets you a very precise design, and that's if you have an inkjet printer and you have specific printing transfer sheets. With that, you can print a design and then use that to transfer it to a linoleum block. I would only use that if you're looking to get a very, very precise, specific design, and you're willing to put in the time, because then you have to peel away all the paper, and that's kind of a pain. So if you're just wanting to kind of get started, try out something for fun, just grab a pencil, grab a light colored linoleum block, and sketch your design directly on the block. Any questions so far?
Nope, so far so good.
Cool. Then this right here is a piece that I've already been cutting on, and I'm still new to printmaking in terms of designs and cutting, but it's something I really enjoy. So you can see just from here, not all of my lines that I've cut are super precise yet, but I still have time to clean that up. Another change in, excuse me, you can get linoleum that's mounted. This is an example of a mounted linoleum block. But I would say you really don't need to buy it like this. It's going to be more expensive to buy linoleum mounted. I would really only recommend getting a mounted linoleum block if you are wanting to do stamping, so getting it in a small size like this, or if you actually have a printing press. But again, I don't think that's necessary. You can get along just fine by getting unmounted linoleum. It's also easier to carve. So again, a big important thing is to make sure that you are carving away from yourself, and that includes your hand. So if you don't have a bench hook like me, you want to make sure that you're not carving towards your hand, because one slip in, ouch. So you can use a hand to stabilize your design, but again, you always kind of want to keep your hand focused on moving the blade forward in an upward motion. You can kind of get away with the angles by rotating it as you carve. So for instance, I've got a chunk here that I haven't carved out yet, but it's on an angle. So if I were to keep my hand here, that's a big no-no, because the moment I put this in, if I slip, if it's a little hard and I put too much pressure, that's not what you want to do. Keep your hand here towards the back. You can carve in, and as you're rotating, just keep it steady. This is not a quick process. Lino carving takes time, and you want it to take time because you want those precise lines. My blade still feels really, really loose, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on there. I think when I was holding it, it just loosened a little bit. Okay, so again, try not to put in any fingers like this. Try and keep it towards the back and just carve away from yourself. Again, no fingers are in danger, and just rotate the block as necessary. And this is going to be true of any kind of carving that you're doing, any kind of cutting that you're doing. So I'm going to carve around this spiral here. And this is a little bit thicker of a blade than I would use, but it does have the advantage of clearing a large portion of linoleum. And if your linoleum is firm and you don't want to get an iron or anything like that, all you have to do is really wiggle your blade back and forth like that as you cut, and it will move it forward. That way you don't have to increase the pressure. So just by kind of toggling it back left to right as you cut, you're going to still have a nice line on your edge, but it allows you to kind of control how much pressure you're pushing forward into your material while also not slipping forward. So it allows you a little bit more control and allows you to still cut away the areas that you need to cut. So I'm going to rotate this again, keep my hand to the back, because I'm going to try and cut against that line I drew there. I'm going to rotate that again. So you can see I still, with a big blade, you can still keep it up against your lines that you're cutting against. So this is probably an outline I could have made a little darker, but I was still able to get a fairly clean line. Now, this has a lot of fine lines, a lot of fine details, and this blade that I have on here is the biggest one, so it's probably not going to help me with the entirety of this design. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it back off. This back up, because again, I don't want it to go flying whenever I drop this like so. Toggle that out, and I want a little one. I think I'm also going to keep the V tool out because I think this may take a little bit too much time, the smallest one, and then I'm going to put all these back in. Big one back in. And then I'm going to start with that teeny blade in my tool. So sometimes these things can be a little finicky. Sometimes they're cranky and they're like, I don't want to fit. And you know what? That's okay. Because even if it takes a couple tries, it will fit.
So
Doesn't matter how many times you.
Caitlin, is that the kind that has a slight divot where the piece fits in, that you have to make sure it's lined up in that spot?
This one does not actually have a specific divot. You can put it anywhere around the base and the entirety tightens up against it, wherever you have it in the center.
Okay.
Okay, so this is my tiniest one, and I do have some fine lines here where I just don't want to use my large gouge because it may erase some of the details that I'm trying to have in my final print. So for instance, this area around the curlicue, I don't want to accidentally have hand slip and cut off my very nice lines or my okay lines. So Again, that's a big no-no. What do I have here? My finger's out in front, and that even if it's a little blade, you don't want to do that. So again, hands always behind the blade. Okay, so even on this corner bit, what I would do is just rotate it and make sure that as I'm carving, that blade is not pointed towards any of my fingers. And again, because there's details here, 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 here that I have, that's why I'm using that small blade. And it can be messy. You'll see a lot of shavings come off, but that's okay. That's why I'm using a flat table. And at the end, you can just take a brush, your hand, a piece of paper, and scoop it all into the waste bin. Do we have any questions about printmaking in general that I can answer while I'm carving?
None that have directly come up, but do you have a preference of working from thicker to thinner lines or thinner to thicker, vice versa?
Every artist is different. I know some who really want to make sure that they get precise lines outlined. So there are some people who will take the knife blade and they will outline all of their details first so that when they take a bigger tool, that piece is already inclined to come apart. So they keep that crisp line. I know some people who prefer to take the big gouge blade and kind of carve away all the excess bits. So that's actually what I did when I started with this piece. Is I knew I didn't want these corners. So I just used the gouge blade to take off those corner bits I didn't want. For me, that actually helps me get accustomed to the material that I'm working with, allows me to kind of get used to the tool again, because if it's been a minute since you've carved, you definitely want to ease into it. You don't want to just jump in willy-nilly. Take your time with it, because this is definitely a labor of love. See? And your hand can slip. Luckily, I didn't cut into the linoleum because I'm using very light pressure around here, but just kind of goes to show no matter how experienced or not you are, these tools really sometimes have a mind of their own. It's always good to go slow. I really do like this wiggle back and forth. It gives you a lot of control versus just carving and trying to dig out a bunch. But going back to that question again, there's no one right or wrong way to do this, except carving towards yourself. Don't do that, that's wrong. But in terms of starting with blades to finish, the only time I would say that you really want to be specific in how you're carving is with details. I wouldn't carve fine details into areas unless the surrounding linoleum was already kind of done. Just because the details are a secondary layer, right? So if you take your, if you do all the details and then you go in with your gouge, you may unintentionally carve off that, and it's work that then you didn't need to do. So it's always good to do the details on your final kind of layout area that you have. At least that's what I would recommend. It doesn't hurt. You can definitely do your details while you're carving. And by details, I mean, so I have already carved out certain arabesques, and I have some indentations in them that I mean to take out to add an extra detail. I don't have these lines here carved yet. I do have a little outline on one just because I was practicing, but like over here, I have some details that I want to carve out. And right here, just again, to get some fine lines and details. Does that make sense?
Yes, and as far as how you angle your tool, is there any ideal, like a 45-degree angle or a whatever works for you?
I would say, again, as long as you're carving away from yourself, carve at whatever angle is most comfortable to you. I would say, again, there's going to be certain lines of your design that as you're carving, you may want to approach it differently than you would other areas of your design. But I would say whatever is comfortable and whatever allows you to preserve your design intent. So right now I'm trying to decide if that was a smudge or if I meant to keep that area. That's one of the downsides of doing graphite on linoleum is your hands are always going to be on this stabilizing it, or sometimes you might rest your hand on part of it, meaning the design can sometimes smudge. So you may actually lose some details. But as far as you should definitely carve at a 90-degree angle all the time or 45 degrees. I've never been that great at geometry. I would really say just make sure you're using the right size blade for the lines that you're trying to cut away. If you're just trying to outline something and you have the small blade up, small blade's not going to hurt. If you're just trying to make sure that cut lines are where you want it, this one, you're not going to carve super deep. Again, it's good for fine details. It's very easy to take a bigger blade and take that detail out if you're like, I actually don't like that. I actually want that gone. So again, as long as you're using the right intent with your blades, with your angles, you're not carving towards yourself. This is really an easy way to get your feet wet in carving. And as you get more comfortable, you can switch to firmer materials. You can experiment with wood, for instance. Again, I have here with me an example of a different material, unopened, because I don't do a lot of wood carving. And I would not necessarily recommend using the lino cut blades on this piece of wood. Again, this is just a standard block I got from a hobby craft store, and it's a lot thicker and it's a lot harder. And this is actually a softer maple wood comparatively. So to do woodblock printing, you want something thicker, and you also want sharper tools. These are not sharp enough. Linoleum can be firm, but it's not this firm. But really, carving is quite relaxing. It's a good way to focus on something else while still being creative. And the finished result is quite worth it. Linoleum block prints can be printed on paper. They can be printed on textile. So if you, for instance, have like a denim jacket and you wanted to add a fun design to the back of your jacket, this wouldn't be a bad method for accomplishing that. you could design something on a small block and repeat it across. Again, for that, you just want to make sure you're using a fabric ink and not a standard, I guess, relief ink. Depending on what the mixture is. Some of the relief inks are actually water soluble. So if you put it on textile, you don't want to wash it and find that your design is washed away. So that would be what I would keep in mind if you're going to do a textile-based relief printing.
So, Caitlin, speaking of ink, is there a specific type of ink that you have to use, or can you use just regular acrylic paint, or?
So, in my experience, you can use a specific relief ink print that's not going to be an issue. I have right here a recommended Speedball brand for relief ink. But again, I would say your ink really comes down to your intent. If you're just going to be printing on paper, a standard acrylic is going to be fine. If you have an ink, like a stamp pad, and that can cover your printing. So if you're using a block this size and it fits on your stamp pad, go for it. As long as you're covering this, that is fine. And again, if you're doing textile, you could do acrylic. Just know that acrylic and clothing is an interesting dilemma, because in some cases you can wash it a million times and it'll still be on your pants. For instance, if anyone's done canvas painting and gotten it on their clothes and had a bunch of paint stains, if you're a kid from the 90s, early 80s like me, you may remember that was a style choice at one point, or at least where I lived, it was. So some acrylics will stain, but again, if you're wanting a very precise design, I would get a fabric-based ink for that printing. But if you're just trying this out and you happen to have a bunch of acrylic, definitely go for it. It's not going to hurt it. These are not very porous. Like this surface here, it's not stained by the graphite. If I were to take a rag, I could wash all of the design off. So that's kind of a nice thing about it. You can always erase what you have on your block. Does that answer it? Or did I just muddy it further?
No, I think that answered it. Thank you.
Cool. You're welcome. How are we doing on time?
We've got about 10 more minutes.
Okay. Then one thing I definitely do want to show, I can either keep carving or I can actually do an example of inking and printing. Do we have a desire to see one over the other?
How about we make it a poll? Raise your hand if you would like to see inking. We have a majority on that, so let's go ahead and demo it, right now.
Ooh. All right. So even though this piece is not finished, I'm going to go ahead and ink it for you guys. It's also a good way to see where else you need to fine tune your cut. So if you're ever concerned about the quality of it and you think you're almost done, it does not hurt your print to go ahead and run a print with ink, because you can see lines where you need to clean up an edge real quick. Now, this can be a little messy. So I have here some lovely newspaper that I'm going to open up just like so. And I'm actually going to use my old linoleum plate here to spread ink out. And then I'm going to use the sprayer, this lovely paint roller, to kind of get a good layer on the sprayer. And then I'm going to use it to spread the ink on my plate. All right. Make sure you guys can see. So a lot of printing ink comes in containers like this. And because you don't need a lot of ink to get going. You can literally take anything, kind of spread it out right here. And I think that's actually going to be pretty good to start. And if I need more, I'll add more. So again, it doesn't take much. You're not trying to get a very inky process kind of going, if that makes sense. Because the more ink you add, the longer it's going to take to dry. So let's see here. Just roll that back and forth. And my brayer is entirely covered. I like that. I want to make sure all the bits are off of it. Okay, and then you're literally going to cover this like a wall. So you just want to roll over it. And again, this is going to show you all the relieved areas that you have still raised. And you want this to have an even inking. So let's see here. I think just about got it. And if you need more, just go back here for another pass. You don't want a lot, so again, it doesn't hurt to roll back off. You want it to be tacky. You don't want it to be smooth. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Hey, Caitlin.
Yes.
Could you repeat? You said you don't want it to be what? It kind of cut out on the audio on that last part.
You don't want it to be tacky, or sorry, you want it to be tacky. You don't want it to be smooth. So when you roll ink, you can definitely tell when there's like a lot of ink because it rolls really smooth, and when it's tacky, it sticks. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's to help keep it from getting too blobby, right?
Because the goal is to have a good printing, and the more ink you have, the more it'll spread, and you won't get those crisp lines. So this is not the recommended thickness for paper for printing, but this is thicker than most paper. This is just from a sketch pad that I have. It's perfectly fine to try out different kinds of paper. So this is where we're going to flip our design, and then we're going to use a brayer. So, or not brayer, Baron. And in this case, I have this inkwell that's nice and circular and flat, and this is where you can use that wooden spoon. And what you're trying to do, since we don't have a printing press, which is much more expensive, is we're just circular motion backward so that have pressure. So that
Hey, Caitlin, your volume speaker's messing up again.
Sorry, I think it's the motion of the table, but. So what I'm doing here is that circular motion is exerting equal pressure. That's why circles are ideal for the Baron. I think that's pretty good. So what we're going to do now is we're going to lift this up. And there you can see our relief print. So you can see areas where I clearly removed a lot of the block where I didn't want ink. And you can definitely see that there are still some areas in between where maybe I need to clean up those lines. This is also a good indication of how much ink I need on that lino block, because as you can see, it's very faint. So with the Baron, I could probably go a little heavier on the ink. Does that make sense? So this method is also really great for discovering how much ink is best for your design, for your lino plate. And that's kind of the basic overview of how this all works. Once you add ink to the mixture, your hands may get a little bit more dirty. I got a little bit ink going. And on the palms, I have some graphite from smudging where my hands were on the plate and carving. But I could now take this and just take some soap and water and gently wash it, and I could go back to carving. Any questions about this?
And we're at 3 minutes left, so if you want to make this kind of the last time to ask questions, we can do that.
I'll do another inking with a little bit more ink, just so we can see what that looks like. I'm not concerned about that drying or how that's going to affect any papers in my book. So again, looks like I need a little bit more ink for better printing. And if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I'm just, at the time we have left, going to demonstrate what this kind of looks like.
Okay, we have two questions. One, so this is quite similar to stamping.
It is, I would say the biggest difference is going to be the firmness of the material. Linoleum is much harder than rubber. So again, it means you can do some really fun, precise lines with this material. Over time, linoleum can break down and start to crumble. And with stamping, it's normally a smaller surface area that you're exerting pressure, at least in my experience. So yes, I would say the basis of printmaking, for relief printmaking, they are all the same. If I were to add a two-tone to this block, I would have to make sure it's the same size as this block. I would actually, rather than do the Baron on the back of my block here, another way of doing a printing would be to run it underneath your paper so that you get that same surface area. So you could run your Baron on the top of the paper as well, and that's slightly different from stamping. But yes, in principle, anything that is relief-based is going to have this similar method. What was the other question?
Could you remind us of the inks to use in general again?
If you're just going to do a standard print with linoleum, I would just search for relief ink. It's I would stick to anything acrylic based for a permanent print. Now, if you're not concerned about using any other material other than paper, you can definitely get something water soluble. You just want it to be something that you can easily spread out over the surface of your block. So if you have stamping ink and it's something that's not already in a pad, that should work. If you're going to print on any fabric, I would say stick to acrylic or stick to a fabric-based ink, just because that's, again, going to give you the best permanence. So this is doing the opposite. So if I were doing a secondary color on this last print, it's, I would just have to match where I had my block on the other stable surface area, and I could literally lift this and place it back on top of the block in the same spot to get that second color on the print. So does that answer all the questions we have today?
I believe so. Thank you.
And we're at the end of our time.
All right, I hope you had fun. I definitely did. And if you have any more questions about printmaking or basics of lino cutting, do feel free to send us an email and we can help. We definitely will. A recording of this lesson will be posted to YouTube at a later date, as well as emailed to you afterwards. And please comment on our survey. Thank you guys so much for coming. We really appreciate it.